The limits to which we can have free speech in society has been brought to the forefront by a couple of high-profile cases. One of which was the case of Lucy Connelly in 2024, who became an unintended hero of the right. And the second was that of Bobby Vylan, aka Pascal Robinson Foster, who became a hero of the Israel-hating left in 2025. These two incidents were ones in which the public words of these two people got them into trouble, and although many perceived that both of these people had committed the same crime but were treated very differently, there were some differences between the two cases that probably led to a very different outcome for both of these people. So let's look at each case separately and compare the two. On the 29th of July 2024, a 17-year-old boy called Axel Rudakabana murdered 3 children in a malicious, unprovoked attack in Southport. Despite actually having been born in the UK, the fact that Rudakabana was ethnically African, having been born to Rwandan parents, this incident already stoked existing tensions that had been building up in the country following what appeared to be the accelerating rate of asylum seekers and migrants entering the country and being placed in hotel accommodation while their asylum claims were being processed. And real or not, the perception was that many of these immigrants, likely not having grasped by this point the mismatch between their own cultural patterns of behaviour and those of the indigenous population, had committed crimes. As such, the local communities, who were becoming more and more agitated by this situation, either didn't know that Rudakabana was not a migrant and was technically British, or considered that it didn't matter because with an approach to immigration that was perceived by them as too liberal, what then led Rudakabana's parents being let into the country in the first place and breeding this monster. This incident was then the spark that ignited the powder keg that had been building up. At this point, we then saw the beginning of the beginning of anti-immigration riots and protests across the country. On the same day that the Southport attacks occurred, Lucy Connelly, the wife of a Conservative councillor, Raymond Connelly, also boiled over when she heard the news. Responding to false online rumours that Rudakabana was actually an asylum seeker, and seemingly to try and discharge some of this anger, she then posted on the social media platform X, quote, "Mass deportation now, set fire to all the effing hotels full of the BASTARDS. For all I care, if that makes me racist, so be it," unquote. This post was then viewed 310,000 times before she ultimately deleted it. Connelly was then arrested for this post, as this technically breached Section 18 of the Public Order Act 1996, which states that, quote, "A person who uses threatening, abusive or insulting words or behaviour or displays any written material which is threatening, abusive or insulting is guilty of an offence if A, he intends thereby to stir racial hatred, or B, having regard to all the circumstances, racial hatred is likely to be stirred up thereby." Therefore, even if Connelly was not intending for people to actually burn down the migrant hotels with the migrants actually in them, it could be argued that a lot of people might interpret this as a calling to do so. Some of you might be thinking, well, surely migrants aren't a racial group. However, in the preceding section of the Act, Section 17, this states that, quote, "Racial hatred means hatred against a group of persons defined by reference to colour, race, nationality, ethnic and national origins of However, in the preceding section of the Act, Section 17, this states that, quote, "Racial hatred means hatred against a group of persons defined by reference to colour, race, nationality, including citizenship, or ethnic or national origins," unquote. Although it could be argued that although the ethnic and national origins of migrants are very diverse, ultimately it appears that the fact that these foreign people form a distinct social group, ethnically different from the mainstream British population, was enough to define them as a race. For this, Lucy Connelly received a 31-month criminal sentence. At least 40% of this sentence was to be served in prison. The rest was to be served with her being allowed to reside in the community on licence. Not a suspended sentence, a prison sentence spanning over 2.5 years. My sense was that the reason why this sentence seemed so heavy-handed for what was essentially a tweet was because the government wished to set an example, not primarily because they wished to stamp out hate from a laudable and moral perspective, although ostensibly at least that's what they may have claimed, but because they were trying to curtail potential civil unrest. It would be in no one's interest for public and private property to be smashed, people to be hurt and violence to occur which could potentially lead to death. You may say, well, aren't the courts independent of the government? Well, I would say never forget that the courts are an entity overseen by the state. After all, the very laws that the courts adhere to are set out by successive governments. So Lucy Connelly gets the book thrown at her. However, the unintended consequences of this was that the people who shared her sentiments became even more enraged and indeed viewed Lucy Connelly as a martyr to the cause. Not only this, but this then sparked a freedom of speech debate, with those who were advocates for free speech arguing that this sentence was excessive for a tweet, and this portended a slippery slope in the direction of the state control of free speech. These reactions, and also appeals to the High Court, did not make any difference, and as such Lucy Connelly was eventually released after serving 40% of her sentence, including the time she spent on remand. In summary, whilst her sentence could be argued to be excessive for a tweet, it could also be argued that her tweet could have been considered by some as encouragement, if not a calling, for them to carry out the actions that she suggested. The potential for this being very high given the contemporary tensions that existed in the country at the time. Then we turn to the next case of freedom of speech outrage. This was the case of Pascal Robinson Foster, aka Bobby Vylan, one half of the so-called punk duo Bob Vylan. During Glastonbury 2025, tensions were particularly high between Free Palestine supporters and the State of Israel. Hamas and several other Palestinian militant groups committed terrorist attacks in Israeli territory on October 7, 2023. Israel then retaliated against the Palestinians and tensions amplified between the two. Given what I have said previously about the world becoming a more global community, from that point onwards the Free Palestine movement gained momentum, and given the increasing numbers of Muslims now living in the Western world, Muslims and also white Western people who were sympathetic to the plight of the Palestinians then began to protest on the streets of the UK on a weekly basis. This then transformed the movement into popular culture. It was then seen to be cool and anti-establishment to then protest against Israel and to highlight the plight of the Palestinians. In a community of music-loving, young and often middle-class people, this cause was destined to be embraced at the Glastonbury Festival. For two reasons. Firstly, these young people are already primed for left-wing causes by virtue of the fact that they are simply young, idealistic and more likely to be non-taxpayers. And secondly, being young, they have a natural spirit of rebellion and anti-establishment, reinforcing the perception, correct or otherwise, that our own government and other governments around the world are complicit in assisting Israel to subjugate and kill the Palestinians. So Bobby Vylan sought to try and be cool and played to the crowd by poking fun and contempt at the right-wingers who stated that they, quote, wanted their country back, unquote, and also jumped onto the Free Palestine bandwagon by chanting death, death to the IDF, meaning the Israeli Defense Forces. To be fair to Bobby Vylan, though, Vylan had a long history of supporting the pro-Palestine anti-Israel movement, so this was probably nothing new to him. But nonetheless, as with Shirley Manson from Garbage the following year, an anti-establishment bandwagon was invariably being jumped on. So then the right-wingers, likely incensed by Vylan making fun of their views and opinions, and many Jewish people feeling uncomfortable with this only feeding into the growing culture of anti-Semitism in the UK, became vocal in claiming that Vylan had promoted hate speech and should be arrested. The BBC, who the right wing perceived to be virulently left wing, also got into trouble for allowing this apparent hate speech to be broadcast without pulling the plug on this as it was happening. Subsequently, Bob Vylan then had many of their upcoming performances cancelled, and a police investigation was initiated, presumably following complaints. Fast forward to Christmas of that year, and Avon and Somerset Police announced that no further action would be taken over Bob Vylan's chance. Many right-wingers saw this to be a reflection of what has now become a popular term, two-tier policing. The perception was that the establishment, under a Labour government, came down heavy on Lucy Connelly's hate speech with a 31-month criminal sentence because she was anti-immigration and right-wing. Yet Bob Vylan got away with hate speech because they are pro-migration and left-wing. But there is a difference, and it's not political, it's legal. The reason why we have hate speech laws in this country is to act as a deterrent designed to pour cold water on tensions between political and racial groups that has invariably bubbled up as the UK has become more diverse, and as the British population has become much more heterogeneous in terms of its ethnicities, religions, politics and cultures. And invariably those differences have created tribal and sectarian tensions. As for Bob Vylan, did it have any impact on their commercial success? Well, I don't know yet, but my guess would be that it was a positive and a negative for Bob Vylan. It was a fact that many of their gigs were cancelled by promoters who probably sympathise with the right-wing point of view on this, or who just wanted to distance themselves from the political heat that this generated. This will have harmed the band. However, as the American showman and circus owner P.T. Barnum once said, there is no such thing as bad publicity. And I would wager that due to the publicity that this generated, Bob Vylan has since amassed a cohort of new left-wing followers who had never even heard of them before. I don't know which of the two is stronger, but I would imagine that either way, their popularity has now been pushed more underground as a result.